E-commerce psychology, powered by Growth Suite. Growth Suite helps you to run smart discount campaigns on your store. Test it for free on your Shopify store. Just land on the Shopify App Store now and test it for free. All right, so welcome back to e-commerce psychology. Today, we're really going to dig deep into something that is like fundamental to every single buying decision that your customers make online. We're talking about emotions, right?
Yeah.
But specifically, we're going to unpack how two very powerful emotions, hope and fear, how those play together and kind of driving those, those clicks, those add to cart moments, all of that.
Right.
So we've got a really interesting article here that we're going to be diving into called The Perfect Balance of Hope and Fear in Product Marketing E-commerce Psychology.
Catchy title.
Yeah, it is. And, if you're listening to this show, you're probably already pretty interested in what makes online shoppers tick.
Right.
But this is really going to give you like a practical shortcut to like understanding how you can actually use these core emotions, hope and fear in your marketing to get better results.
Yeah, absolutely.
So our goal today is basically to break down how skillfully, weaving together these messages, like I said, of aspiration. So that's hope and a little bit of caution. And that's where the fear comes in. How that can lead to marketing that really grabs attention, but also, builds those authentic connections with customers, encourages them to take action, all without feeling, salesy or pushy or anything like that.
Right.
So what really jumped out at me when I was reading this article, and maybe you saw this too, was that it really emphasized right from the get-go just how central emotions are in buying decisions.
Oh, for sure. Yeah. I mean, it's a good reminder that, we like to think that our customers are sitting there like with a spreadsheet weighing all the features and benefits and, rationally going through it all.
Yeah.
But the truth is, most decisions, especially buying decisions, are made on gut feeling.
Absolutely, yeah.
And so, the article talks about how marketing has kind of shifted away from just presenting dry facts, just the features and specs and all that, and moving more towards really trying to tap into these emotional triggers.
Absolutely. And it's not just like, some marketing guru's hunch or something,
Right.
Like there's actual science behind this. So the article highlights some really interesting research. And basically what they found is that the emotional centers of our brains, they actually light up before the rational parts when we're making a choice.
Wow.
Isn't that wild?
Yeah, that makes sense, though.
So like that little surge of dopamine, that we get when we think about, oh, I'm going to get this reward. That can be a really powerful motivator. It happens even before we like consciously process the information about the product or whatever.
Right. It's like that impulse buy. You see something, you just,
You got to have it.
you want it.
Yeah.
And then later you're like, wait, why did I do that? It's like, and if we look at it even more broadly, the article cites some statistics that suggest that a huge chunk, like a really big percentage of what we buy is driven by these kind of, underlying emotions.
Yeah.
Things like, wanting to feel secure or the thrill of a new experience or even just, wanting to project a certain status.
Right.
So as people become more self-aware, I think, about their emotions, those emotional responses to marketing, it's more important than ever to understand how to tap into these things ethically, of course.
Yeah, absolutely.
To actually connect with people.
Yeah, and this is where like the whole hope and fear thing really comes into play. So, the article defines hope in a marketing context. And basically it's like, that little spark of, oh, something's could be better. It's that enthusiasm for a brighter future.
Right.
So as an e-commerce store owner, that means you've got to show your customers how your product or service can actually make their lives better.
Tangibly.
Yeah, tangibly better. So it could be like, more happiness, better health, whatever their version of better is.
Right.
Okay, so then on the flip side, there's fear. And the article describes it as basically tapping into that very primal instinct that we all have, to avoid loss or danger. It's that like caveman brain.
Yeah, tiger in the bushes.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So how does that translate to e-commerce?
Well, it can be anything from, like a limited time offer, like you don't want to miss out on this sale.
Yeah.
Or highlighting the consequences of not taking action. Like, if you don't buy this software, your website might be vulnerable.
Right. Yeah.
So it's a way to, create a little bit of urgency. And when it's done right, it can be, it can really nudge people to make a decision.
Yeah. Like I was thinking even like, those abandoned cart reminders.
Oh, yeah.
Like you put something in your cart, you leave, and then they send you an email like, hey, you forgot this.
Yeah, don't leave this behind.
Yeah. And there's that little bit of like, oh, I don't want to miss out.
Totally.
It's so interesting how the article frames hope and fear, though. It's not like they're opposites, right? It's not like good versus bad.
It's two sides of the same coin.
Yeah, exactly. It's like they're both really powerful motivators,
Yeah.
but they work best when they're balanced.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the sweet spot. So it's not about just constantly, like being super positive and aspirational.
Mm-hmm.
It's also about acknowledging that your customers might have some anxieties or some fears, and that you can address those in a way that feels helpful and not manipulative.
Yeah, absolutely. And, if we think about why this balance is so important for, the bottom line, there's some really solid arguments in the article.
Yeah.
It's not just about, getting those quick sales. It's about building those relationships, the long-term loyalty that really keeps customers coming back.
Right. Yeah.
Because, if you're a brand that shows you and understand both what your customers are striving for, so that's the hope, their aspirations, but also what they're trying to avoid, so that's the fear. Well, you're going to connect with them on a much deeper level.
Right. So it's like, by acknowledging those pain points that your customers are experiencing, but then also offering those, hopeful solutions, you become more relatable.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. It's like, oh, this brand gets me. They understand where I'm coming from.
Yeah, they're speaking my language.
Yeah.
And the article really emphasizes that, that feeling of connection is so important for customer retention.
Yeah.
People are more likely to stick with a brand that makes them feel seen and heard.
Absolutely. And I think the other thing that's really important here, especially in the world of e-commerce, where there's so much competition, is differentiation.
Oh, yeah. That's huge.
If everyone's just kind of shouting about, amazing features or the lowest prices or whatever, it's hard to stand out. But if you can find that balance between hope and fear, you can create something that feels more unique, more authentic, and ultimately more human.
Totally. And that's what people are looking for, especially online where it's so easy to get lost in the noise.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay, so we've talked about why this balance is so important. Now, let's dive into the how.
Yeah.
What are the psychological principles that make hope and fear such strong drivers for customers,
Right, because it's one thing to say, okay, use hope and fear.
Yeah.
But how does that actually work on the brain level, right?
Exactly. And the article delves into some really fascinating neuroscience.
Okay.
Which, I always find really interesting.
Yeah, me too. Me too.
So brain imaging studies have shown that hope and fear activate different parts of the brain, like literally different pathways.
Okay.
So hope tends to light up the areas associated with reward processing, the pleasure centers.
Okay.
And a lot of this involves dopamine.
Okay. Yeah.
Which, is the neurochemical linked to pleasure and motivation.
That makes sense. So it's like when you anticipate something good happening,
yeah,
you get that little hit of dopamine.
Yeah, exactly. You order something online and you're like, oh, I can't wait for it to arrive.
Yeah.
You're getting that dopamine hit just from anticipating that.
Oh, that's interesting. Okay, so then what about fear?
Yeah, so fear, not surprisingly, triggers the amygdala, which is like the brain's alarm system. It's like the fight or flight center.
Right.
And so this can be, a really powerful reaction.
Yeah.
But as the article points out, you have to use this very carefully.
Right, because
you don't want to overdo it.
You don't want to scare people away.
Exactly. It's like, you don't want to set off their alarm bells so loudly that they just run in the opposite direction.
Right. Yep.
It's about finding that right level of tension, where it motivates them without making them feel overly anxious.
Yeah.
But understanding these neurological underpinnings, it gives you a better grasp of how to craft your messaging to either, tap into that anticipation of a positive outcome, the hope,
right, or
create that sense of urgency to avoid a negative one, which is the fear.
Got it. So, okay, so we've got the brain science.
Yeah.
What about the bigger picture?
Well, the article connects this to some broader psychological frameworks, which I think is really helpful.
Okay, like what?
So one is the broaden and build theory.
Okay, I've never heard of that.
So basically it says that when we experience positive emotions like hope, our thinking actually becomes more expansive.
Interesting.
So we're more open to new information, more creative in problem solving, more receptive to new ideas.
So it's almost like hope makes you like more adventurous as a consumer.
Exactly, yeah. You're more willing to explore.
You're open to trying new things.
Yeah.
Okay, so what about the opposite then?
Yeah. So fear, on the other hand, tends to narrow our focus.
Mm-hmm.
When we perceive a threat, our brains are like, okay, time to hunker down, focus on survival.
Right.
And so we become more fixated on finding immediate solutions and protecting ourselves.
Right.
So you can see how this plays out in how you market different types of products. The article suggests that for those aspirational products, the ones that are about, living a better life, achieving your dreams, hope-based messaging can be really effective there.
Mm-hmm.
But for products that are more about security or solving a pressing problem, like a security system or something like that, fear-based messaging might be the better approach because people are already in that mindset of, okay, I need to fix this problem.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And then the article introduces this concept called prospect theory, which is basically this idea that the pain of losing something feels stronger than the pleasure of gaining something of equal value.
Right. Like, we're more afraid of losing $100 than we are excited about gaining $100.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that's why, you see things like those countdown timers on websites.
Right.
Don't miss out. This sale ends in,
Yeah.
Because it's not just about the potential gain of getting a discount. It's also about the fear of missing out on that discount.
Right. Yeah.
But, the article makes a really important point, which is that you can't just rely on scarcity tactics all the time because constantly bombarding people with don't miss out can get tiring.
Yeah.
And it can actually start to feel a bit manipulative.
Yeah, and I think it kind of misses the point of building those, like you said, those long-term relationships.
Totally. Because
Yeah.
you want people to buy from you because they genuinely believe in your product, not just because they're afraid of missing out.
Right, yeah.
So you have to balance that with the hope, the positive side of what your product can do.
Yeah.
Like imagine how much better your life will be with this.
Right.
So it's about understanding when to use each approach strategically.
Got it. So this is all like super interesting, but I'm curious, like how has the use of hope and fear in marketing actually changed over time?
Well, the article actually provides a bit of a historical perspective, which I think is helpful to kind of see the bigger picture.
Okay, so what's the history here?
So early advertising, like way back in the day, really leaned heavily on fear.
Really?
Like they weren't afraid to use scare tactics.
Interesting.
So, think about like old toothpaste ads.
Mm-hmm.
They'd show you all these like horrible images of tooth decay.
Yeah.
Or security system ads. They'd play on your fear of being robbed.
Right.
It was all about buy this product or bad things will happen.
Wow.
But as consumers became more savvy, they started to see through those tactics. And also regulations came in to prevent companies from just outright scaring people into buying things.
Yeah, I guess like constantly being bombarded with negative messages, it probably gets old after a while.
Right, exactly. You become desensitized. And so that kind of paved the way for a shift towards, more aspirational, hope-based marketing.
Yeah.
And this is where, brands started showing you that idealized version of yourself. Buy this product and your life will be amazing.
Right, like the perfect vacation or the perfect body or, whatever.
Exactly. And social media, of course, has really accelerated this trend.
Yeah.
Because, positive, uplifting messages are just more shareable.
Yeah.
They're more engaging.
They're more fun to look at.
Exactly.
Okay.
But the article makes a really good point, which is that in today's world, a purely positive approach can sometimes feel a bit fake.
Right.
A bit disingenuous.
Yeah.
We all know that life isn't perfect.
Yeah.
So pretending that it is can actually alienate customers.
Yeah, it's not realistic.
Exactly.
Right.
So that's why more and more brands are now using this more integrated approach where they're blending elements of both hope and fear.
Mm-hmm.
It's about acknowledging the challenges, but also offering those hopeful solutions.
Okay, so like give me an example.
Yeah. So think about like cybersecurity software.
Okay.
They might start by highlighting the risks of data breaches, identity theft, all that scary stuff.
Mm-hmm.
That's the fear.
Right.
But then they immediately pivot to, but don't worry, our software will protect you.
Mm-hmm.
That's the hope.
Right.
So it's a way to address both sides of the equation.
Got it.
And the article suggests that consumers today they're more emotionally aware.
Yeah.
They can see through those blatant fear tactics, like the over-the-top scare tactics.
Right.
But they also respond well to genuine positivity that acknowledges that, life isn't always sunshine and rainbows.
Yeah.
It's about being authentic.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So let's dive a little deeper into the effectiveness of fear-based marketing.
Okay.
The article really highlights how powerful fear can be in terms of grabbing attention. It triggers that primal, that fight or flight response in our brains.
Right.
So if you see an email subject line that says, urgent, your account may be compromised.
Oh, yeah.
You're going to click on that.
You're clicking. Yeah.
But the article cautions, that fear is a double-edged sword.
Yeah.
Because if you overdo it, if the fear you're evoking is too intense or it feels manipulative or it's just not relevant to your product, it can backfire big time. So customers might get annoyed, they might distrust your brand, or they might just tune you out completely.
So it's all about like finding that sweet spot.
Exactly, finding that right level of tension.
Yeah, where it motivates action without like scaring people off.
Yeah.
Exactly. And the article provides some specific situations where fear can be effective.
Okay, so like what?
So, for example, highlighting health risks.
Okay.
If you're selling a product that helps people quit smoking, you can talk about the dangers of smoking.
Yeah.
Or if you're selling, a security system, you can talk about the risks of burglaries.
Right.
And fear can also be really effective when you're targeting risk-averse customers.
Right, those people who are already kind of like worried about things.
Exactly. So you're kind of playing into their existing concerns.
Yeah.
But the article does warn about, the potential downsides of relying too heavily on fear. Like it can lead to a negative brand perception if people start associating your brand with anxiety.
Right, you don't want to be the doom and gloom brand.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And there's also the risk of desensitization. Like if you're constantly hitting people with fear messages, they're just going to tune it out.
Yeah, like the boy who cried wolf.
Yeah.
Of course, there are ethical considerations. You don't want to be manipulating people into buying things out of fear.
Right. It's got to be genuine. It's got to be real.
Exactly.
Okay, so we talked a lot about fear.
Yeah.
Let's talk about hope, the other side of the coin.
Yeah, let's bring in some positivity.
Yeah. So the article talks about how hope can actually create this what they call approach behavior. So it's like when you see a product that promises to make your life better, you're more likely to like lean in, explore it, maybe even buy it.
Yeah, it's like it creates that sense of possibility. Like, oh, I could have this.
Yeah.
My life could be like this.
Yeah.
And that's really powerful.
Absolutely. And I think hope, it creates those good vibes, right? And people want to be associated with brands that make them feel good.
Totally. And it can also foster really strong customer loyalty.
Because when you help customers envision those lasting benefits, like this product is going to help you achieve your goals. It's going to make you a better version of yourself. You're building that deeper connection.
Yeah.
You're not just selling them a product, you're selling them a better future.
Yeah. And I think hope is like especially effective for certain types of products.
Oh, yeah.
Like lifestyle brands, personal development, health and wellness, all those things where people are like actively seeking positive transformation.
Right, yeah. And you see this all the time in those industries.
Yeah.
It's all about aspirational visuals, uplifting language.
Yeah.
It's about showing people what's possible.
Right. But just like with fear, there are some caveats with hope.
Oh, yeah.
You can't just like go overboard with the positivity.
Right.
Because if you make promises that are too good to be true, people are going to see right through that. And it can actually damage your credibility.
Exactly. It's like, that saying, if it sounds too good to be true, it probably is.
Yeah, exactly.
And the article also talks about this idea of toxic positivity.
What's that?
It's this idea that constantly being positive, no matter what, can actually be harmful.
Really?
Yeah, because it can invalidate people's genuine struggles. If someone's going through a tough time and you're just like, oh, just think positive.
Right.
It can feel really dismissive.
Yeah, like you're not taking their real problems seriously.
Exactly. So it's about finding that balance, acknowledging that life has both ups and downs.
Yeah.
And that's what brings us back to that perfect hope-fear balance that we were talking about.
Right, because ultimately, it's not about choosing one over the other.
Mm-hmm.
It's about finding that sweet spot where they work together.
Exactly. Because people want to feel like they're moving towards something better, but they also want to feel safe and secure.
Right. And the article actually cites some studies that found that the adoption rate of new products can be higher when consumers experience a blend of excitement and a little bit of nervousness.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, so it's like they're excited about the potential benefits, but they're also a little bit worried about, maybe missing out or making the wrong decision.
Right. So it's like that FOMO, that fear of missing out.
Exactly.
But it's also mixed with like that positive anticipation.
Yeah, and I think timing is really important too, right?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Maybe early on in a customer's interaction with your brand, you might want to hint at a potential problem or a missed opportunity just to kind of, grab their attention.
Yeah, like get them thinking.
Yeah.
Make them aware of the need.
Right. And then once you've got their attention, you can really focus on the hope, the positive reinforcement, show them how your product can make their lives better.
Exactly. So it's kind of like a 1-2 punch.
Yeah, I like that. So is there like a framework or like a formula that people can use to get this balance right?
Yeah. The article talks about this really practical framework called the pain solution gain approach.
Okay.
And it's pretty straightforward. So first, you present a pain point.
Okay.
So this is where you tap into the fear. Are you struggling with this problem?
Right.
Then you introduce your product as the solution.
Okay.
So this is where you start to shift towards hope.
Mm-hmm.
And then finally, you paint a picture of the positive outcome.
Okay.
Once you use our product, your life will be like this.
Right. You're showing them like the light at the end of the tunnel.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the article emphasizes that this sequence can be adapted to different marketing channels.
Okay. How so?
So, for example, on social media, you might lead with more hope-focused content. Beautiful visuals, inspiring stories.
Right, because that's where people are just kind of like scrolling through. You want to catch their eye.
Exactly. But then in email marketing, you might be a bit more direct.
Okay.
Address a specific pain point, offer a solution.
Right, because they've already opted in. They're more engaged. They're ready for that kind of message.
Exactly. And the same goes for video or even your website copy.
Got it.
You can tailor that sequence to the specific platform and the audience.
So it's not like a one-size-fits-all thing.
No, not at all.
Yeah.
And importantly, the article emphasizes that you need to be constantly testing and optimizing.
Yeah.
Try different approaches. See what works best for your audience.
Right, because what works for one brand might not work for another.
Exactly. And what works for your audience today might not work for them tomorrow.
Yeah, it's all about like staying flexible.
Right. Totally.
Yeah.
And paying attention to the data.
Mm-hmm.
Are people clicking on your ads? Are they buying your products?
Yeah.
What are they saying about your brand on social media?
Yeah, all of that.
All of that gives you valuable insights into what's resonating.
Okay, so far we've been talking about this in a pretty general sense. But I'm curious, like how does this actually play out in different industries?
Yeah, so the article gives some really great examples of how different sectors are using hope and fear effectively.
Okay, so let's start with like health and wellness.
Okay, so in health and wellness, the balance is often struck between highlighting the potential negative consequences of inaction, so that's the fear, and showcasing the positive benefits of a healthy lifestyle. That's the hope.
Okay.
So, you might see ads that talk about the risks of heart disease, but then they'll also show you images of people looking fit and healthy, or they might use testimonials from people who have achieved their health goals.
Right. So it's about like scaring them a little bit, but then giving them that hope that, okay, but it doesn't have to be this way.
Exactly. And it's important to note that this industry is heavily regulated. So you have to be very careful about the claims you make.
Right.
You can't just make stuff up.
Yeah.
It has to be grounded in science.
Right.
But there's